Yeah, welcome to the third annual Dianoia seminar in metaphysics and epistemology, which is going to be given this year by Cian Dorr from New York University. So before we get started, it's custom here at ACU to start with an acknowledgement of country. So we commence our meeting by acknowledging the first peoples and traditional custodians of the country where Dianoia is located, the Wurundjeri peoples from the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to their elders, past and present, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people here today. So let me introduce Cian. He's professor of philosophy at New York University. He's held positions at Oxford University and the University of Pittsburgh. He's published over 30 fantastic articles in metaphysics, epistemology, logic, the philosophy of language, the philosophy of physics. A really fantastic paper called Against Counterfactual Miracles was selected by the Philosopher's Annual as one of the 10 best philosophy articles published in 2016. In 2020, he gave the Hempel Lectures at Princeton, and his recent work has focused on logical and metaphysical issues that arise in higher order logics, which is what he's going to be talking to us about today. So please join me in virtually welcoming Cian.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dimitri. I'm really happy to be here. I only wish I could be there in person. So thank you so much for the invitation. And yeah, I hope I get to visit sometime before too long. And thanks for everyone who had to get up at unusually early times in the morning to be here. It's a bit noisy here. Yeah, okay, so as Dimitri said, a big theme in my work in the last few years has been this thing called higher order logic, which is a very straightforward generalization of the first order logic that's taught in standard logic classes. So I'm quite excited about higher order logic, and I think it's a really important tool for various fields of philosophy, but especially metaphysics. So what this talk is, though, is me trying to go back to some topics that I have been fascinated by for much longer than that, and that I got into long before I really had any clear understanding of, let alone sort of intellectual affiliation with higher order logic. And so what I've been doing in this project is kind of going back to some of these questions and trying to rethink them through the lens of what now feels to me to be the right formal toolkit for making progress with these kinds of questions. So in particular, what I'm thinking about today is this old philosophical chestnut about nominalism, where nominalism is something like the view that there are no abstract objects, or the view that every object is concrete. The meaning of concrete in that formula is a bit of a vexed question. I'm just going to equate it with the view that everything is a material object, where material means stuff like has a mass, a spatial location, that sort of thing. Something along those lines. The details will not of how that's spelled out really don't matter very much for the kind of dialectics we're interested in. So, so in the literature in which people debate that kind of thought, those kind of sweeping ontological generalizations, like everything is material, which I kind of have a fondness for, and had a fondness for in my older work. I even wrote a paper called "There Are No Abstract Objects" back in 2007. One of the big things that people who go around saying that sort of thing have to face up to is these really, really quick arguments which seem to refute the thesis. And I'm thinking of arguments like this. Mars is red, and this apple is red. Therefore, there's a property that Mars shares with this apple. therefore there's a property, but no material object is a property, therefore there's something that isn't a material object. That's one example of the form where the sort of the load-bearing word is this word property, but there are many other things that you can sort of see as in the same general family. For example, arguments having to do with numbers and propositions and relations and types and all kinds of other things that would prima facie seem to be not material objects, whose existence seems to follow from very ordinary and humdrum claims. All right, so that's the kind of setting. Despite the existence of these very, very quick arguments against nominalist style doctrines like everything is a material object, the doctrine sort of refuses to die. There's a sense that there should be something tenable in that vicinity that can survive this kind of argument. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, okay, so there's a handout that Dimitri has been sharing in the chat, and I'm actually also going to share it on my screen so that I can sort of gesture okay, I can't see you anymore. I liked it if I could see you. Oh well, okay. I can't both see you and share my screen, but I'll have to just remember that you're there. I'll try to resist the temptation to just forget that I'm in the middle of giving a talk. Is there some?
There might be a way to change
seeing like
so it's like side by
what happens
side,
to those little,
and then you see
little pictures of people that. Okay, hang on. Let me just pause this for 1 sec. If I move you over to this screen here, and then if I share my screen, how about that? Okay, that's a bit better. Good. Okay, I didn't like that feeling of being sitting here at my dinner table, just talking to my computer. Okay, so so that's the debate I'm thinking about, and now I'm going to tell you what higher order logic is, and then we'll see how it can help with that debate. This is inevitably going to be like too quick to be a very pedagogically helpful introduction to the thing, but I do think it's very simple. If I had my way, this would in fact be part of the standard sort of intro logic curriculum. So the hallmark of these higher order logics of higher order logic is that you can have not just predicates that take individuals as arguments, which we have in first order logic already. In first order logic, we've got two kinds of things. We've got things that take singular terms and turn them into sentences, called predicates, and then we've got also these things that take one sentence and turn it into another sentence, the connectives. And in higher order logic, what we add is things that take things of other grammatical categories and turn those into sentences. So for example, we can have a predicate that combines not with a singular term, but with itself a predicate that combines with a singular term and makes that into a sentence. And we have also the capacity to make complex expressions of all those different kinds, which we do using variables and something called lambda, which is a variable binding device. And then finally, we have quantification and identity in all those higher types as well. Okay, so the things get a little bit complicated because we now don't have just a simple contrast between sentences and terms. We have various kinds of grammatical categories in the language, and it's traditional to keep track of these using these special strings called types. And I'm going to be using a really basic type system in the logic in this paper. So it consists of the letter E and the letter T, and everything that you can make out of those by the operation of taking two such strings, putting parentheses around them, and an arrow in between them. With one exception, you don't have, in my type system, just to avoid some distractions that it will bring up, I don't have E as a terminal type. That means I can't write down things like E arrow E. That's not a type. The thing that goes on the right of the arrow has to be a member of this set T0, as you see on the handout, and T0 comprises all the types except for E. So that's all that definition is saying. So these are just some strings. There's nothing controversial about them. Their job is just to keep track of the syntactic categories of our language. We're going to allow various kinds of. So the intuition is things of category E are the singular terms, the ones we already have in first order logic. Things of category T are sentences. Maybe T stands for something like truth evaluable or something like that. Anyway, there's the sentences. And then something of type sigma to tau is something that combines with something of type sigma and makes something of type tau. So for example, the negation sign would be of type T to T. The and sign would be of type T to T. That's how we deal with binary relations. We think of them as or binary things. We think or n-ary things. We think of them as taking their arguments one at a time. Say an ordinary first order predicate F would be of type E to T. If it was a singular predicate E to T, it's as if it's of a if it takes two individual arguments and so on. On the slides, I'm going to be having to write out a lot of these things, and they quickly get really long. They were just spilling out over the margins of my handout all the time, and even worse on the paper that this is based on. So I'm tentatively using the following abbreviation. So highlighted there. If I just write some types, sigma 1 through sigma n, with a vertical bar across the top of them, that's short for sigma 1 to blah, 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 to sigma n to t, where with the parentheses there associate to the right. So it's sigma 1 to sigma 2 to sigma n to t, close all the parentheses. Okay, so that's what's going on with those over bars that you're going to see all over the place. Okay, so that's the kind of language, and we're going to have a couple of logical constants I'll tell you about in a sec, but we can also have some non-logical constants of various types. So, for example, we might, depending on what we're interested in talking about, if we're interested in talking about necessity and possibility, we might want to have constants of box and a diamond, which would be of type T to T. But there's various other topics which make it natural to introduce non-logical constants of various other types. In particular, I'm going to be talking a lot today about the topic of meaning, and regimenting talk about meaning in higher order languages is a very natural thing to want to do. And it's natural to do it using a whole bunch of different kinds of non-logical constants, each of which takes two arguments, a string, whatever type that is, a string like the thing that has the meaning, a linguistic expression on the one hand, and something of a given type sigma on the other hand. So for example, you'd have a meaning predicate that takes a string and something of type T. That would correspond to the English expression, means that, as in snow is white means that snow is white. But you could also have a meaning predicate that takes a string and a singular term that might be analogous to refers to, this, like as in quote Mars refers to Mars. Or you could have a meaning predicate that takes a string and something of type E to T, that is to say a first order predicate. And that would be analogous to the use of means that we find in English when we say things like quote red means red, where there we seem to be able to put a predicate red on the right-hand side of the word means. Anyway, that's what, in English, that's a kind of a funny way of talking. It seems to go against sort of some usual rules about where expressions can appear. But in a higher order language, with a family of constants for talking about meaning, that would be a completely normal and well-formed sentence. Okay, so that's an example of the kind of non-logical constants we might want to have in one of these languages. So here's the rules for building up complex expressions. First of all, there's a rule for variables. That's this one here. That just says that for each type, there's an infinite family of variables in that type. So we think of each variable as having a built-in type. That's the type of expression that it is. So a cool thing about these languages is that we have variables, not just like singular terms, but for every grammatical category, we've got variables in that category. We also have constants, which we just import into the language. And then we've got two basic ways of forming complex expressions out of simpler ones. The first is application. So I already kind of explained this and explained the intuitive significance of these types. If we have an expression of type sigma to tau, and another expression B of type sigma, we can combine those together just by writing one after the other to make an expression AB, and that's something of type tau. So for example, if A is a predicate, that would be E to T, and B is a singular term, that would be type E, then we can write AB, and that's just a sentence of type T, as we already see in first order languages. More interestingly, we have another way of making complex expressions called abstraction. And this is supposed to be the analog for this kind of language of the manifold ways that we have in English of making complex predicates. So in English, we can do things like we can conjoin in various types. We can have like John is red and John is round, or John is red and round. John loves someone, John is loved by someone. There's all these things we can do in English that make complex predicates. In these higher order languages that I'm working with, all of that is simplified down to a single operation for making complex terms, which works as follows. If you take something of type tau, where that tau is a terminal type, and you take any variable v of type sigma, then you can write a parenthesis followed by the Greek letter lambda, followed by that variable, followed by a dot, followed by a, followed by a closed parenthesis. And that whole thing is now a complex expression of type sigma to tau. So for example, we could, if A was a sentence with a free variable like red x and round x, and v is the variable x, we could make this complex predicate of type e to t, lambda x, red x, and round x, which is going to be the analog in this kind of language of the English complex expression red and round. So those are the two basic things. And then finally, we just have two logical constants. I'm paring back on. I'm keeping the number of logical constants low for no particular reason. It's just easy. You can in fact define all the other usual ones in terms of these, which I just decided to do. So we just have the material conditional, which we're just treating as a special logical constant of type t to t to t. And then for each type sigma, we have a universal quantifier of that type. The universal quantifier we think of as a higher type predicate. It's a predicate that combines with a predicate to make a sentence. It's a predicate that wants a monadic predicate of type sigma things. This is I think a really important insight from Frege's Begriffsschrift that quantification should be thought of in these terms, where the quantifier word is taking the thing that it combines with as its argument in the way that predicates take their subjects as arguments. Anyway, this is how we do quantification in this kind of language. The usual quantification notation, we treat that as just an abbreviation. So you can write for all v dot p, and that's short for all of the appropriate type applies to lambda v dot p. So that just keeps things simpler than having sort of syncadiagrammatic quantifiers floating around alongside lambda as a binder. Okay, that's how it works. my view about all this is it's fine and we can understand it. I think, and moreover, we can understand it not by way of any sort of stipulative translation from it into English, but in a more direct way by understanding how the syntactic categories work and sort of exploiting analogies between the ones that are relatively familiar and the rest to see how the logical constants are supposed to work in all the different types. So in particular, I think the interesting way of understanding this language does not involve sort of stipulatively translating it into its sentences into English sentences using words like property or relation or proposition and so forth. Nevertheless, it's often really helpful just to, when you're, especially in this kind of situation where you're trying to give a talk and you've got this handout and it's got these symbols all over it, and you need to make some helpful sounds come out of your mouth while trying to direct people's attention to the symbols. It's really helpful to come out with these English sentences involving words like property, just as a kind of an informal pronunciation scheme for higher order sentences. So for example, here's a higher order sentence. I'm highlighting it on my, I hope you can see when I highlight things on my screen, not for all x, where x is a predicate variable, if x of Mars, then x of Venus. Natural to pronounce that as something like not every property of Mars is a property of Venus. Likewise natural to pronounce there exists P such that not P, where P is a type T variable. That's something like some proposition is not true, or maybe some state of affairs does not obtain, or something along those lines. But useful as that is, the interest of this talk depends on the idea that we're not just treating this thing as sort of stipulatively equivalent to those English glosses. Okay, I should say something also about the background logic that I'll be assuming for this language. And the answer is it's just the familiar classical first order logic generalized in the obvious way to this setting, but with one maybe not quite so obvious wrinkle. So I'm presenting it on the handout in a sort of a natural deduction format. I thought maybe that would be familiar to some people. Lots of the other work on this uses a sort of a Hilbert style formalism, which is interchangeable. And what you see here is there's just the usual rules of, well, there's just the usual structural rules of assumption and weakening, the usual introduction and elimination rules for the material conditional. We've got generalizations of the usual quantifier rules, which apply to the quantifiers in all the types, where of course the generalization is just that like the relevant variable or term has to be of the appropriate type for the quantifier that you're using. Oh, we've got the double negation rule down here. That's familiar as well. And then finally, the more controversial thing is a conversion rule, which says that you can freely go back and forth between different forms that are that stand in a certain relation called beta-eta equivalence. Maybe I'll just delay. I won't tell you what that is just yet. It's the kind of natural thing once you have these complex predicates formed with lambda floating around to have some way of manipulating them. So that's the kind of the default way of doing that. Okay, so that's the setting that I now feel like, well, that's something I understand, and it's not something my understanding of which required me to settle those hard old questions about nominalism and whatnot that I used to worry about. But maybe I can use my understanding of it to help make some progress with those old questions. So you can distinguish. So the old questions are formulated not in this nice hygienic formal language, but in English. The question was like things like, is everything material? Those kinds of questions. And and the arguments against them were likewise formulated in English. And then I think an appealing thought, once you've taken this kind of step of feeling that you can understand the higher order language, a natural thought is, oh, these things I was calling the informal glosses of higher order sentences in English actually really just are, literally just really do have that higher order meaning in English. So, for example, some property of some property holds of Mars is just how you say in English that there exists an X of type E to T such that X of Mars. So that's a kind of a deflationary hypothesis about what expression sentences like some property holds of Mars mean in English. It's a hypothesis on which the meaning of those sentences, the truth of the literal truth of those sentences, is perfectly consistent with the hypothesis that everything is material, where that everything is understood as a first order quantifier. So the hypothesis, that's the hypothesis I call this kind of E-materialism, that for all X type E, X is a material object. So that's a natural, I think, formal sharpening of what we were trying to get at in English with sentences like everything's a material object. Certainly, I guess I have some authority here. So I did write this paper in 2007 called "There Are No Abstract Objects," and through the lens of current higher order quantification understanding me, yeah, it seems right to me that when I said things like that, I was intending that to be a type E quantifier, an individual quantifier, not some higher order quantification. So that's one thought that you could have. It's not inevitable. You could certainly think, and many people have thought, that words like property in English don't work like that, and rather have meanings such that the truth of some property holds of Mars, or Mars and Venus share some property, or something like that, all require there to be a rich domain of individuals of a kind inconsistent with E-materialism. A domain in which they require what's called an ontology of universals, an ontology with where in addition to ordinary material objects like sticks and stones, you have these very special things that are the right sort of individual for the English word property to apply to, and a special way in which those cool universals can stand to material objects called instantiation and so forth. That's a perfectly intelligible hypothesis about how English works, even for those of us who feel like we understand higher order logic, and it's one that's been defended on various grounds. Nevertheless, I feel like there's a lot to be said for the deflationary hypothesis, assuming we can get it to work. It just doesn't seem. It seems like perhaps the most salient thing about the use of these words like property, proposition, and relation, and so forth in English is precisely the fact that people unhesitatingly go back and forth between things like Mars is red versus Mars has the property of being red, and things like that. It seems like if we can find a way to do justice to that kind of reasoning, to interpret what's going on in English in such a way that people are that really is a straightforwardly logically valid transition, then seems like a much more plausible interpretation than one in which all English speakers have somehow all internalized and become, completely, take completely for granted some incredibly specific and properly controversial anti-e-materialist hypothesis on which there are these things called universals. Okay, so what the rest of this talk is about then is trying to flesh out this deflationary hypothesis on which, in fact, the English so-called glosses, the property talk in English just does have these higher order meanings that can be spelled out carefully using higher order quantification. It takes work though, because there's a real challenge for this kind of view, which is whether we can provide a defensible, systematic, compositional theory of meaning for English that explains why the sentences mean what they supposedly do. Okay, so that's what I'll be trying to make some progress with. So what I'll do, I'll first say some general things about the kind of shape or architecture of the kind of thing I'm looking for, namely a theory stated in higher orderese about meaning for English. Then I'll sketch out what the kind of deflationary semantics for property talk that I like would look like when implemented in that way. And then I'll talk about some influential objections to that view. I should stress, this is not at all, and the idea of a deflationary treatment about this, it's not a new idea to me. In fact, lots of the old literature particularly kind of assumes that anyone who can make sense of higher order quantification will, of course, take this attitude towards English. I don't think it's a matter of course, but because I think that there are some really tricky objections that have to be got around. Yeah, so anyway, just don't want people to think that I think I'm blazing new ground here. I'm not. Okay, so originally I suggested that to theorize about meaning in higher orderese, we'd be wanting to have a family of constants that take a string type argument. Maybe I'm not sure what strings are. Maybe you think that's E to T or something. And then some other argument of some other type. So where you get to say this string has this meaning of whatever type. But in fact, when you're trying to come up with a systematic theory that can sort of grasp, that can sort of give sort of compositional explanations of the meanings of complex expressions, it's really helpful to have something a bit more discriminating than that. So in English, there's this phenomenon where you have a single word, or at least a single string, that can have different syntactic categories and has different semantic behavior depending on its syntactic category. So think of the word fish, which is both a noun and a verb, and has really obviously different meanings as a noun and a verb. And we need to somehow track that. Because if we don't keep track of it, we won't be able to explain why the sentence "you fish" means something different from the sentence "you are a fish." So those are two sentences which just like should, yeah. So if it seems like we need to somehow be able to say fish means this property, the one that the things in the sea have, qua verb, and it means this other property, the one that the thing with the fishing rod has, qua noun. Sorry, other way around. Noun, swimming thing, verb, fishing rod holding thing. So we need to somehow do that. So what I'm going to do is add an extra argument place to my sort of primitive family of semantic predicates. So now we won't be just saying this string has this meaning, this string has this meaning. We'll always be saying this string has this meaning relative to this syntactic category. What's a syntactic category? Well, it doesn't really matter what they are, because their job is just to sort of serve as labels to stop us from confusing different meanings that the same thing, or just to help us keep track of this kind of contrast. But just for concreteness, I assume that they also are strings. So for example, we have a category, the letter N is one category that kind of means noun. The letter S is another category that kind of means sentence. And NP is another category, which kind of means noun phrase. Okay, so, and then assuming we can also help ourselves to various unproblematic predicates like planet and twinkles and so forth, we can start to write down things like this. So this is how I write: planet means planet as a noun. So the thing on the left, the italicized planet, that's a name for the string planet. N is one of these category labels. This is the one that means noun. And then this thing here is a constant of our higher order language of type e to t, or that's what I'm going to say e to t, but that e bar, that's just short for e to t. That's what I just put subscripts and things, superscripts and things, so you remember what their type is. And then this whole string, this little string of four dots, that's the predicate. It takes 3 arguments. We put the first argument on the left, then the other 2 on the right. So then this whole thing is a sentence in my higher order theory, in which that predicate takes the 3 arguments: string planet, string n, and planet. And here's another one. I can make complex strings. So here's no planet twinkles, and here's how I say it qua sentence means that there does not exist an x such that x is a planet and x twinkles. So now this is the sort of thing I can now say in my higher order language that I'm building my theory in. Of course, there aren't just those. There's a lot of different syntactic categories we might want to use in English. You could just try to give a finite list, but there's actually there's a really elegant way of doing this that comes from Bar-Hillel and Lambeck that lets you do something a little bit less stipulative looking, where you build up complex syntactic categories with 2 different kinds of slashes. There's a forward slash and a backslash. So, and the intuitive meaning is that if you take if C and D are syntactic categories, then something with category C / D is something that wants to combine with a D thing on its right in such a way that the whole complex string will be a C thing, while something of type D / C is something that wants to combine with a D thing on its left in such a way that the whole complex thing will be a C thing. So the output always is sort of the upwards direction of the slash, and the input is the downwards direction of the slash. But which side the input comes in is this given by the angling of the slash. So that's a very well-known way of setting these things up syntactically and semantically. What's nice about it is then that you can write down some really simple laws which tell us about the semantic properties of complex expressions given the semantic properties of their simpler constituents. So there's 2 of these laws. There's sort of higher order schemas. They're called function application laws. There's a left to right one and a right to left one, which I annotate with the sort of greater than and less than symbol. Let's just look at the left to right, the right to left one, the left to right one. It says that if A means X, where X is something of type sigma to tau, qua C/D, that's to say something that spits out a C given a D on its right as argument. And B means Y of type sigma, qua D, then if I join A and B together, that complex string means XY, which is something of type tau, qua C. So this is just gluing, you glue together it just says actually I wrote down a gloss. When A has the type sigma to tau meaning and B has a type sigma meaning, and moreover, the categories relative to which they have those meanings are the right kinds to allow them to combine, then the result of concatenating them in the appropriate order has the type tau meaning that results from applying X to Y. And then this derivation on the handout. Sorry, my sort of when I try to, you can sort of see. Anyway, that derivation there is just illustrates how once we have these laws of combination, we can start to make explanations of why complex things like sentences mean what they do. That is to say, why they express in type T what they express qua sentences from premises about what their individual constituents mean. So here we just derive by 2 applications of the right to left function application axiom that no planet twinkles means what it intuitively should mean, where the premises we use are that, well, planet means planet, qua noun. Twinkles means twinkles, qua, well, that's that thing there, NP \s, that means verb phrase. It's something that makes a sentence when you combine it with an NP, that's to say a noun phrase on the left. And no means this higher order quantification thing, qua thing that combines with a verb phrase on its right to make, that combines with thing that combines with first a noun on its right, and then to make something that in turn combines with a verb phrase on its right to make a sentence, which is the standard sort of Montague-based, though Frege derived ultimately treatment of English quantifiers. So, okay, this is the general architecture of semantic theory that I think is appropriate to be working with. Now we can sort of see how to implement the basic deflationary thought within that setting. This is a very common, I mean, derivations that look like that, albeit with a host of different confusing philosophical interpretations bolted on top of them often, are just kind of meat and potatoes for a whole lot of theories in semantics that are kind of in one way or another downstream from the work of Montague. However, in the semantics literature, people who build theories that look, or build, like going around and make derivations that look like that, typically are working in a setting where for each syntactic category, there's a unique associated type, such that anything that has any meaning relative to that category has that type of meaning relative to that category. So for example, they'd be thinking, oh, verb phrases, that always goes with E to T. Noun phrases, that always goes with E. Quantifier-y things like no, oh, that always goes with E to T to T to T to T, that sort of thing. This is something we could add, and it would, in the setting of this kind of theory, it would take the form of the following schema, which says that it doesn't happen that a single expression, that there's a single category C is such that something both means has a meaning, has a row type meaning in that relative to it, and also has a sigma type meaning relative to it, where those are two different types. We certainly could throw that in, but I'm going to just suggest let's not throw it in. Let's see what happens. And the answer is, oh yeah, if we don't throw that in, then we can totally smoothly implement the desired deflationary meanings for sort of property talk type sentences just by giving some words meanings of sort of higher types than you might have expected given their syntactic kinship with some other words. So consider this derivation. So the sentence is Mars instantiates redness. You might think, oh, instantiates, transitive verb. Other transitive verbs like orbits, well, that's just a regular thing of type E to T. If you believed correspondence, you then have to think, well, instantiates, another transitive verb, that also expresses something of that same type. And then you'd be in this problem because you'd be like, well, hang on, what is this magical relation that some individuals stand into other individuals called instantiating? It seems like for that to be interesting and work in the appropriate way, you need to have one of these kind of rich, mysterious ontologies of first order surrogates for higher order things, what we call universals. But instead, let's just give up on correspondence. Then we get to say, yeah, instantiates got the very same syntactic category as any other transitive verb. But what it expresses is not a property of individuals, not a thing of type E to T, but rather a thing of type E to T to T. Sorry, delete that last sentence, but not a relation of type E to T between individuals and other individuals, but rather a relation of type E to T between E to T type things, properties, and individuals. Yeah, and namely, it just expresses lambda XX. And then a word like redness. There's all these complications about these abstract nouns, but I'm going to quite assume that we treat redness and as equivalent to the property of being red. Again, mostly because constantly typing out the property of being red made everything spill out into the right margin of my handout. So redness, although it kind of looks like a proper name a bit, it doesn't express anything in type E. Rather, it expresses something in type E to T, qua noun. And what it expresses, what it denotes in that type is exactly what the verb phrase is red denotes in that type. So this is the view where the nouny thing, redness, and the verby thing is red have exactly the same denotation. However, they denote what they denote relative to different syntactic categories. Whether you want to say they're semantically, I used to be thinking of this as a view where they're semantically on a par and merely syntactically different. But then in some conversations, I realized some people were wanting to call that a semantic difference too, because it does, after all, make a difference to how they can contribute to the semantic properties of bigger stuff involving them. But anyway, I think so long as we understand what's going on, it should be clear how this works. So that's how we get a completely boring meaning for Mars instantiates red. What about quantification? Well, the one new thing that introduces is the phenomenon, and which is going to have to be a really quite pervasive thing in this theory, of what's called type ambiguity. So we already know to get appropriate meanings for things like, some planet twinkles, we're going to have some is going to have a meaning that combines two properties of individuals, is a relation between an E to T thing and an E to T thing. Maps both of those to a T. But we're going to also want to have higher type meanings for some, because after all, we want it to come out that some property of Venus holds of Mars can mean that there exists an X such that X of higher type of predicate type such that X of Venus and X of Mars. We can do that by saying that in addition to its low type familiar meaning, some also has the meaning of a higher order quantifier, and specifically a binary quantifier that takes in two properties of properties, two E to T arguments to make it a thing. So some is now type ambiguous, and of course, this is not. I seem to have forgotten the part in the handout. It's not just doesn't just have two meanings. It's actually going to end up needing, because we can kind of keep on building more and more of these. We can have property of Venus, we can have property of redness, we can have property of being a property of Venus, and so forth. For all of those, we're going to have in fact a whole schema where for any type alpha, some expresses that the relation there exists an X. The relation lambda X lambda Y, there exists a Z such that XZ and YZ of type alpha to T. And it's not just the word some. All kinds of predicates are going to have to have these type ambiguous treatment, where they have meanings in many different types. So interesting. We can't just say, we can say not just Mars is interesting, we could also say redness is interesting. Since redness doesn't have a type E denotation, it only has this higher type denotation. Interesting is also going to have to for that to mean, it's going to have a high order property meaning that takes in a type E to T thing and spits back a T, and not just one, but a whole hierarchy of these. Or a transitive verb mentions, we can say not just Aristotle mentions Mars, but also Aristotle mentions redness. Aristotle mentions being a property of Mars, and Aristotle mentions being a property of redness. So mentions becomes infinitely many ways type ambiguous with a meaning of type alpha, relation between alphas and E's for every type alpha. And in fact, it's not just these sort of words like some and interesting and mentions, where we have sort of interesting meanings, contributions we want them to be. We kind of know what they should mean roughly in various different types. Even for a word like is read, where it's really unclear, there's no obvious candidate thing for it to mean in any type other than E to T. But still, this sentence, redness is red, is certainly grammatical in English. And I'm inclined to think we should also think that it's meaningful in English. Not that there's any particular thing that I'm convinced that it means, but it's just that there's bigger sentences that do seem evidently meaningful. Like, it would be strange if I said that redness is red, or either redness is red or is not the case that redness is red. Those kinds of things which embed it. And it seems like a principle I like is that a meaningful complex expression should be such that all of its constituents are also meaningful. So I think redness is red needs to be meaningful. So is red, and not just is interesting, but also is red needs a higher type meaning as well. It's true there isn't a sort of a super compelling, obvious candidate to be that, but I'm just thinking, well, the natural thing, we'll just say, well, maybe you can just have a sort of an empty meaning, an uninstantiated property. After all, redness is red doesn't sound, it's probably sounds kind of false. So good. So let's just say, so even is red is also type ambiguous. It has an interesting meaning in type E to T, and it has kind of boring, trivial meanings in higher types. And in fact, the general picture we have is that every verb phrase has a meaning of type sigma to T for every type sigma. And likewise, every noun. And similarly, every transitive verb has a meaning of type sigma 1 to sigma 2 to T for any two things. These general schemas guarantee that well-formed things are always going to be meaningful. It's true that there often aren't natural candidate meanings for them, but I think it's better to let them go trivial somehow rather than having them go completely meaningless. So that's how I like to set up my deflationary theory. All right. This has taken way longer than I thought it would. So I'm going to talk about just one classic problem for this view, which is a kind of a classic view. So I'm afraid that the original, we haven't had much original yet, but there's a bit of originality coming. So here's the classic problem, which I found various examples of people saying, this is a decisive knockdown refutation of this view. And it has to do with coordination, let's say, occurrences, the words and or. So look at this sentence. 1, either Mars or redness is interesting. Surely that's a meaningful sentence. And indeed, we kind of seem to know what it should mean. It should be equivalent to 2. Either Mars is interesting or redness is interesting. 2 is not problematic for us. The way that we treat this ambiguity, and the way this fragment treats ambiguity, each time you come to an occurrence of an ambiguous word, whether it's type ambiguity or any other kind of ambiguity, you get a kind of a fresh bite at the apple. You get to choose a meaning for it. So for this sentence too, there's no problem getting it to mean interesting of Mars, where the interesting is low type interesting of Mars, or high type interesting of redness, just by pick using the low type meaning for the first occurrence of interesting and the high type meaning for the second occurrence of interesting. The problem is that in sentence 1, we only have one occurrence of the word interesting. So there isn't. It's really unobvious what we could do here. We don't have some magic thing that lets us take a single occurrence of a word, or we don't yet have a magic thing. I guess I'll be sort of telling you about a thing that's exactly like that. But prima facie, we're in trouble because we only have one occurrence to work with. Okay, so how to solve this? The first thing I need for a solution is going to be something totally boring and standard, which is some kind of technology that can deal with conjunctions of, with conjunction and disjunction in subject position. By the way, I'm doing it all with or rather than and, just because I didn't want to fuss around with plural verb endings. You could do it all with and as well. So we need something that can make sense of either Mars or Venus is interesting. And likewise, we'd like it to generalize to either redness or blueness is interesting. These are cases where they're of the same type, so it shouldn't be challenging in the same way. But still, we need to find something we can do. What I'll do with this is just something completely standard. I think the most orthodox and boring thing from the semantics literature, which is the treatment from Party and Ruth, 1983, which in fact generalizes sort of a more ad hoc looking thing of Montague's, which is a type ambiguous and category ambiguous treatment of or. Here, I'm not going to try to talk through. So here's my sort of the general formalism of this. I can capture this using these four kind of axioms. But the basic idea is that or has not just the meaning of the T to T to T meaning of the logic symbol or, but has appropriately lifted meanings in all kinds of higher types as well. And then we combine this with a type lifting schema. This again is a special case of something even more general that you might want to, but we don't need the more general thing. This lifting schema just says if you have something that means X of type sigma relative to category C, then it also means lambda y of X, where Y is of category sigma to tau, what's called the lift of X in this higher type relative to any syntactic category of the form D right slash C left slash D or D right slash parentheses C left slash D. So this essentially lets you, for example, lift proper names, which sort of start out maybe of having type E semantic values, into the higher type associated with quantifier phrases like no planet, which would be type E to T, adjusting their category to match. So once you have this technology, you can make derivations like this one on the top of page 6 of the handout, where you take Mars and Venus. They start out denoting type E things, but you apply lift to get that they also denote type E to T things relative to the more complicated category S slash verb phrase. Then that's the right category to have to be associated with one of these higher type meanings for or. So we can make this higher type meaning for Mars or Venus, which wants to combine with a verb phrase like is interesting. And when you do combine it and you reduce it appropriately, you get what we wanted, namely something equivalent to Mars is interesting or Venus is interesting. All right, that's the easy case. Now, to get from this to the hard case, I'm going to go in a somewhat circuitous way. I'll first describe a syntactically richer dialect of higher order ease, where if we spoke that as our native tongue, it would be actually kind of easy to deal with the mixed coordination problem. So I'll explain how, if we're theorizing in this richer kind of language, we can give such a theory. But then finally, I want to stress that this isn't some difficult new sort of ideological commitment. In fact, we can translate the theory in that richer syntax back into a theory in our old tried and trusted page 1 of the handout higher order syntax, which I think is important from my point of view. At least it's kind of important because the extended syntax is the sort of thing that you might think involved some kind of bad metaphysical picture, the kind of thing that people, or the kind of picture where all the different higher order domains are kind of just treated like different subsets of some master domain, which is just kind of anathema to people like me. So you might think, oh, he's trafficking here in the very bad thing that people like him who think they can kind of have this autonomous understanding of higher order language must reject. But in fact, no, because you can translate it all away. So, okay, I'll just talk for 5 minutes so that there'll be something of substance that you can ask me questions about. Then there's more in the handout that you might want to get into there. So here's what the extended language is what it does is it adds sum types, where the intuition for a sum type, also known as a coproduct type or a disjoint union type, is that if you were doing the bad thing of thinking of types as just names of sets, don't do that thing. But if you were doing that thing, then a sum type, A alpha plus beta, that would be kind of like the name for the disjoint union of the sets named by alpha and beta. That's to say the set of all ordered pairs, all this, like the union, but where we tack on little labels so that we make sure that they're disjoint. So a sort of a set in which there's a representative of each thing. Okay, so here's how the extended syntax works. We have just a new type building thing, plus, which we use to make sum types. This is why I made a fuss about this before. These sum types in the system I'm working with, they're non-terminals. We don't have them on the right-hand side of an arrow, just as we don't have E on the right-hand side of an arrow. We don't need that, and it makes life more complicated if we had it. And then we have three new ways of building complex expressions that sort of use these new types. First of all, when we have something of type alpha, we can type iota superscript 1 in front of it and a given type beta, and that makes it into something of type alpha to beta. Intuitively, the representative of the original thing A in the sum type alpha plus beta. Similarly, iota 2 of A subscript alpha is the representative of some A of type beta in type A plus beta. And then finally, we have a thing where we can take two function type things, something of type alpha to gamma F and something of type beta to gamma G, and sort of glue them together into a thing that I notate with double angle brackets, FG. And that's something of type alpha plus beta to gamma, where intuitively what it does is you feed it something of type alpha to beta. It looks, hey, is this the representative of an alpha thing or the representative of a beta thing? If it's in the first case, it finds the alpha thing that it's the representative of and applies F to that. In the second case, it finds the type beta thing that it's the representative of and applies G to that. So it's a kind of a cases construction. So that's all. We don't need to add any new logical constants. We can treat, there's a natural way of defining all of the quantifiers subscripted with these new extended types in terms of our original simply typed quantifiers. And then the logic we assume for that language is just the exact analog of our old logic H with the sort of extended quantifier rules and a new notion of convertibility that sort of generalizes the notion of beta eta convertibility to these new term forming operators. We really only need to, I won't tell you about the whole part of that thing. So I call that thing triple lines plus. And here's the only two clauses we need to know. These reflect the intuitive gloss I just gave you on the significance of the pair of F and G. The pair of F and G applied to left injection of A is just F of A, and the pair of F and G applied to right injection of B is G of B. Those are conversion rules. We can substitute those anywhere we like inside of a complex expression. All right, so that's the perhaps metaphysically suspect seeming extension of the syntax. Once we have it, but bracket any doubts you might have about it for a sec. If you're okay with it, then it's kind of easy to deal with this problem of mixed coordination. You just extend your system of semantic predicates so that things can express things in the new types, and posit some new lexical entries. For example, say that is interesting, in addition to the meanings we had for it before, also expresses something of type E plus E to T, something that takes something in the disjoint union, namely the result of pairing the two old meanings of interesting. So this is a new posit. That's one thing we need, and the other thing we need is a rule that lets us freely apply the left and right injection term forming operations to the meaning of anything to get another meaning for that thing. So this is just a general injection schema. It just says if A means X of type alpha, then also A means left injection of X in any type alpha plus beta. And if A means Y of type beta, then A also means right injection of Y of type alpha plus beta in the very same category, syntactic category. Note that we're keeping the category constant here. So some other people in this kind of setting played around with versions of this that don't keep the category constant. and give rise to various overgeneration worries, but ours doesn't. With all that technology under our belt, we can give this derivation on page 7. Here's what happens. We take the starting meaning of Mars and we lift it up into the sum type E plus e to t. And then, not lift. We inject it into that type. And then, likewise, we take the starting meaning of redness and we inject that into the same type using the injection thing. And then everything goes just as before. Then we just, now we have turned our two disparately typed meanings for Mars and redness into things of the same type, a sum type. And now we can apply an appropriate, combine those using an appropriate meaning for or, and using the Party and Ruth lifting trick exactly as we did before when we were just doing Mars or Venus is interesting. So basically what injection lets us do is coerce any two things into a single type, where of course the predicate that we are going to combine them with will then need to have an appropriate meaning, as we're positing here for is interesting. So we get eventually, so the thing that we get the desired meaning just by converting down that sort of paired meaning for interesting down at the end, back down into this desired thing. Notice that the explanans here, the thing we've derived, is not itself is just a sentence in the original the original language. It doesn't have any extended types in it, but we derived it from some premises, namely inject and this new entry for is interesting, and some stuff for about or, which does use the new type system. Let me just say then that you could this technology also does something else that you might want to do, which is give a reading for this sentence. Everything Mary mentioned is interesting, where, as it were, the quantifier quantifies over multiple types simultaneously, where it both entails if Mary mentioned Mars, then Mars is interesting, and also entails if Mary mentioned redness, then redness is interesting. So you can get meanings like that for sentences like 6 for any finite collection of your old types by summing them all up into a single sum type. You don't get, using this technology, a meaning for 6 that's tantamount to the conjunction of all of those things. Although in the last section of this handout, which I'm not going to get to, I have some very exploratory thoughts about how you might add some new rules to the whole system, which would get you that kind of master meaning for sentences like 6. And this applies not just to quantifiers like everything and something, but also to more complicated cases like most. Before I discovered this business of sum types, I was playing around with what turns out to be a notational variant of all of this, not using sum types. And I was just going crazy with most, but here you can just take, everything is just very smooth. You can just generalize what you would say about most for any other type to sum types. And then finally, in the last minute, I just want to gesture towards this fact that makes me feel comfortable with all this, which is that all this apparatus of sum types is in fact dispensable. And you can translate this any theory, including the one I just sketched, stated in the language of sum types, into a nice familiar theory using different non-logical constants stated in the original simply typed language. The basic result here is a normal form theorem from Pravitz's book on natural deduction. I guess, in fact, Gensen proved this before Pravitz, but in unpublished work that was never published. What it says is that every term in the extended language is convertible with one that has something called the subterm property, which means that all of the constituents of the term have types that are constituents either of the type of the term or of the type of some constant in the term or of the type of some free variable in the term. So given this, if we're dealing with a sentence which has type T and it has no free variables, then so long as all of its constants have simple types, the theorem says that we can just convert it to a normal form, which is a sentence of the simply typed language. And that's basically what we're going to do. given this theorem, all we have to do is pick some new simply typed constants and take all of the extended typed constants in the theory we're trying to reduce, find definitions of them in the extended language in terms of the simply typed constants, and then apply the Pravitz normalization procedure. And it turns out that there's a completely mechanical way of doing this for the kind of constants that we're working with. And what it does when you take that theory that I described using sum types, what it turns it into is a quite interesting kind of theory, which I was in fact playing around with for a while before I kind of started thinking about sum types, which is a theory where some expressions, instead of just having a meaning, have a kind of a joint meaning in a couple of different categories, in a couple of different types rather. So you have a kind of these interesting new polyadic meaning relations, where, for example, interesting kind of primitively jointly expresses both the low type interesting and the high type interesting. And then you have some other words, like say everything, which expect an unusually large number of arguments and can have all of their arguments provided to them at once when they combine with those other words that have a kind of an unusually polyadic expressing profile. So that's a kind of a more, in some ways, a more alien form of theory, because now we're working with meaning, a notion of meaning that doesn't have a sort of a single fixed adicity, but on the other hand, it's in other ways more familiar because it's just using the ordinary simple type system, not these funny sum types. Fortunately, this reduction result means that we don't have to choose between them. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. Sorry for going on so long, but at least now you know how I'm wanting to reply to what I think is the most the single sort of most influential objection against this whole deflationary approach in the literature. But of course, there are other objections too, and I'm happy to talk about some of those in the Q&A if people have questions. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Cian. So I think maybe we'll take a quick 3-minute break or so, and then we'll have Q&A. And if you have a question that you want to ask in the Q&A, just send me a message in the chat, and I'll add you to the queue. Okay, so let's start off with Johanni.
Yes, I was just curious about the theory that you mentioned that you were playing around with before you read Pravitz. What was it? Because I don't think you didn't tell us about this in Oxford, I don't think, or maybe I missed it. But anyway,
I mean, well, I don't know how far I really got. I was like, oh, this looks like basically, I was like, oh, I could sort of see how to do everything, and then I was just like, I just started filling up pages with. Sorry, I was like, oh, most is going to be a disaster. I don't really understand what I'm doing here. But I can sort of sketch a little bit. So there's this trend, but in retrospect, what I was going for would have the good thing in the vicinity of what I was going for just is the result of applying this Pravitzian translation procedure to the system with some types that I described. So here's what happens when you do that. So
can I participate in my question just a little bit? And yeah. I'm just curious about whether so how different was it from Tarski's idea of representing everything at all types, as it were, below a certain type by things of that type? Like you pick some suitably high type, and then you say you have like a meaning relation where like every term of every type means something at this type and also means sigma, at whatever type the term is. So there's meaning at the unifying type, and then there's meaning at all the lower types.
It was nothing like that, because the things I've been, or in this project, I've always been thinking that if you're going for this deflationary treatment you want of English, then you're thinking you can, in principle, push these things to, in principle, there are going to be meanings of arbitrarily high and arbitrarily complex types, and even non-trivial ones for words like some or for words like interesting and so forth. So, the thing that Tarski was interested in, namely doing the theory of meaning for a formal language with a limit on the, in some sense, complexity of the types that it's that it can have, is kind of different in deep ways from the kind of thing I'm doing, namely doing semantics for natural language, on which understands natural language not to be like that, but rather to be implicitly and in a type ambiguous way, capable of going arbitrarily high up in the type hierarchy. And reflecting this difference, Tarski is interested in this thing of like defining something in syntactic terms that's like a disquotational that behaves as a disquotational truth predicate for one of these cut off languages. Whereas I'm not trying to define anything, and I wouldn't, I'm thinking, oh no, this is like meaning here understood as a phenomenon that a bunch of contingent facts that hold because of how we use language, and would have been otherwise if we had used language differently. Like red means red, but that's got but it could have meant green instead if we used it the way we use green and so forth. So the thing that Tarski is doing, namely writing down a theory such that red means red, or writing down a definition of means such that the claim that red means red will then be just a theorem of some that falls out from that definition plus some syntactic background theory, it's just not the same kind of enterprise at all. So yeah, the answer to that one was very different. I could just briefly backing up to the answer to the previous question. What the theory kind of looks like is you just get to say things like, so to think of it, was like the thought was, don't just ask what things express, ask also what they jointly express. And here's another cool fact about the word interesting. Beyond, not only does it express interesting in type E to T, and also interesting in type E to T to T, but it also jointly expresses that and that, where that's just a primitive sort of polyadic thing about it. And similarly, in addition to the facts we already knew about the word everything, we have that it also expresses something that takes in both a property of individuals and a properties of individuals as two arguments, and as it were, predicates universality in the appropriate type of both of those. And then there was going to be a sort of a generalization of the usual function application scheme, where if you combine a word like everything that's expecting two arguments despite being sort of syntactically monadic, but then you supply it a single word that jointly expresses two things, you can plug the two jointly expressed things into the two arguments of the thing like everything. And similarly for more than two. And it all worked out. I mean, that essentially is what's going on in the sum type theory as well. It's just that instead of saying that interesting just does this and jointly with this, we have this thing notated by the double angle brackets, which kind of bundles them up into a single sum type or extended type item. And similarly, we can express the same meaning for every as a thing that just expects the usual number of arguments, but expects one of these funny sum typey. But essentially, what it's just doing is giving us a kind of a way of coding n-tuples in the So it's just the difference between actually treating n-tuples as things of a type versus just treating them as treating entry-able talk as short for the list of the ingredients.
Okay, yeah, I think I get it. Yeah.
So the next question is from Ray Chung.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I trust the treatment to apply also to natural languages. Even you've mentioned that arbitrarily complex meaning, but that draws my attention to pronouns, indexicals, and demonstratives. So whether, for example, if you want to say, well, except simple sentences like you're interesting, like your talk is interesting. But if you can use, whether the formal language can be used to express translatability between languages. So being yours and using the predicate that, and if you have extensionality.
I think I missed one word. You said being. You said whether it can be used to express being
yours. So like instantiating the property of.
Oh, being yours. I see. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So whether that's something that's on your mind or not.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I kind of think that all work in there's a whole load of work done by people who call themselves semanticists, some of whom are in philosophy departments, some of whom are linguistics departments, who just theorize about a whole host of different phenomena that we find in natural language. And I'm kind of, I mean, sort of the larger agenda visible in this talk is, I kind of think that all of that stuff done in a model theory, set theory-ish setting should be redone or rethought in a higher order setting, as a theory of meaning along the lines of what I'm talking about. And in general, I don't think it makes, I think most linguists can go on just as before. I think there are kind of fairly straightforward ways of taking some body of, some bit of theory expressed in the kind of model theory way and rewriting it as a higher order theory of the kind that I'm interested in. So I think, that goes for all kinds of theories about the semantics of demonstratives and pronouns and anaphora and so forth. I mean, the particular one you picked was you, which famously falls under this heading of indexicals, for which there's this famous sort of model theoretic treatment coming from Kaplan's work from the early 70s, which super influential treatment of that, where essentially you rethink of them, you think of the meanings of words as taking some extra arguments that you call a context, although most words just don't do anything with those extra arguments, but a few words like I and you and pick up those extra arguments. That's fine. I think you can, that thought can just.
But do you restrict that only to English? Do you restrict your treatment only to English?
Well, for any given, I mean, the kind of theories that I'm looking at are theories about a particular natural language, like English. Of course, for any given, of course, there's lots of common patterns that would emerge across different languages. Maybe they all have a word that means you or whatever, but
I wonder whether that's necessary. Yeah.
I mean, so one worry is that you're making some kind of one word that arises in the same way in the sort of original model theoretic setting of these thoughts, and in the sort of higher order logic setting, is that you're kind of you're making a bunch of arbitrary choices all the time. Like, oh, what order do we choose the coordinates? Do we put the speaker and the time and the addressee, or the speaker and there's all these kind of don't care choices. I think you need some. I mean, I think maybe that's what you're thinking. I mean, which as it were, that if there isn't a kind of a canonical way of making them, then you're kind of in danger of making them differently when you're theorizing about English from when you're theorizing about, I don't know, Swahili or something, and then you sort of make some sort of there'll be sort of spurious differences between your theories of different languages that just come from different ways of making these arbitrary choices. So yeah, there is a challenge for that particular thing, that particular semantics makes vivid, of taking theories and trying to see what is the sort of what are the essential differences between, of two different, maybe what might seem like two different theories of the same language or of two different languages, and seeing is this an essential difference, or is this a matter of notational, no, just a different way of making one of these arbitrary choices.
Thank you very much.
This question is from Jillian.
Hey, Cian. It's good to see you.
Yeah. Oh gosh, not having to see.
Yeah. So I find this totally fascinating. I just have a small question about the debate between the nominalist and the objectors. And so I'm wondering about the interpretation of the quantifier in something like everything is material, everything is concrete. When you get this kind of response that says, well, what about redness, or what about properties? And so there's this thought that, well, maybe the interpretation of the everything is just first order quantifier, doesn't include stuff like redness. But then you might wonder why the response doesn't go like that, where they don't say, well, I wasn't talking about properties, or I wasn't talking about redness. And so it made me wonder, like, more generally about the pragmatics of these kind of quantifiers, and like how like accommodation works, or like what happens when somebody says everything is concrete and they get an objection, which is the wrong kind of type.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so the thought was that the thought was that lots of nominalists, at least the more sensible ones, like old me, those guys are just going around with the type E, saying the type E thing. A worry that someone might have, someone might think, oh, that's kind of too much charity to exercise. You might think, oh, that's the kind of dumb thing that's analogous to a theist looking at atheists, and the atheists are saying there is no God. And like, oh, all they must mean is there is no there is no God, nothing other than God is God. So they're just there is no God, but rather than their expression of atheism is in fact signing up to the central tenet of Islam, that there is no God but God. So that would be a really, that's a really misguided form of charity. So clearly, if you listen to what these atheists are doing, they're saying, no, there really aren't any gods out there, and they're like, no, of course I don't mean among the non-gods there are no gods. I mean there are no gods at all. I don't think that interpreting self-described nominalists like old me as meaning the type E thing is analogous to that, because, well, basically type E quantification is absolutely unrestricted quantification in its type, and we shouldn't be thinking, it's not that type E is just a subset of some bigger thing. It's true, we do have the apparatus of some types, so there's a certain sense in which, well, there are, as it were, interpretations of everything that are broader in a sense which includes, they make everything is material come out false. But one thing we absolutely don't have is a sort of a master type of all types or something like that. We couldn't have a type of all types and have everything else that we have right now without falling into Russell's paradox. So there isn't the same sense that really that this is crying out for a strong, I think, for a stronger interpretation than the one that we're providing. So yeah, I guess the thought is that's the question whether everything is material, every individual is material or not. It's just a really good question. It's just not obvious whether they are or not. And that just seems like a sensible thing for the people to be talking about. Whereas we just don't have any interesting property of thing of type E to T for material to mean. I suggested that it has some meaning, but I was like, oh, it just gets some boring, trivial meaning, just in order to make sure that nothing goes meaningless that we don't want, that is grammatically well formed. But it just seems like interpreting them as talking about that just like is just replacing the good question in the vicinity with an uninteresting question. So I guess those are some thoughts about why it's correct to interpret lots of nominalists as really only meaning the type E thing, namely it's an interesting thing to mean, and there isn't some master, and it's as absolutely unrestricted as it makes sense for anything to be.
I'm still a bit puzzled why they don't just say, "Oh, I wasn't talking about properties," when this objection comes up.
Well, they're confused when the objection. Okay, so in general, philosophy is really hard, and semantics is really hard, and even if you speak a language that has this semantic, so in which case that could be a that would be a fine thing to say. I guess the fact that quantifiers are type ambiguous in the way that they are, according to me, is not transparent to speakers. So it's not obvious to them how saying I wasn't talking about redness is compatible with I was talking about absolutely everything, because they haven't grasped the kind of the true pattern of ambiguity here. I mean, of course, lots of them do say exactly that, but they say often with a bad conscience because they feel like they need to say something more, or else they'll have compromised their, or else they'll have reduced what they're saying to some kind of something really boring and trivial or something like that. So they have a bad conscience because they don't know what the further follow-up speech is that responds to, well, in that case, why is what you're saying even controversial?
Okay, cool. Thank you.
The next question is from Hussein.
Thank you, Cian. Hi.
You also heard this talk. You've also heard hearing this for, I don't know how many times you've heard this.
No, this is the first time. I only had the handout.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sort of glad that you said something like, well, higher order systems should swallow semantics and philosophy of language alive. I'm glad you said that because my question is going to be sort of about that.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that there's going to be like some asymmetries in composition that you can observe in like natural language that will not that you shouldn't expect, or like there's no reason to expect from a higher order perspective. And the example I had in mind was something like this. It's like I can say I ate the apple but not the orange, but I cannot say it doesn't make sense to say something like I ate the apple or not the orange. So it's like there's a sort of weirdness like attached to the disjunction part of the, and I mean, one would expect that that has something to do with like what and or and not means. You know, there's like a deeper story. There should be a deeper story. But as far as I understand, I was thinking that, well, there's not going to be a deeper story in the higher order language. You're just going to, you know, define your types, and you're going to say that, well, there's going to be composition with the and not, but not the case for or not. So am I wrong? You can tell can you still tell an interesting story from the perspective of higher order system?
Look, I don't want us to get confused between the general idea that we should be looking for theories, and you know, higher order really should be the language of theorizing and so forth. That's a sort of that doesn't, you know, you can say all kinds of things, and that's got no special treatment of R. But so what you can then look at is, well, this treatment of R that I am adopting here, which is the you know, Montague / Party / Ruth derived theory. Of course, those guys, I don't know, maybe if you ask them that some philosophical questions, I mean, it looks the same, although they maybe had some more model theory focused sort of self-conception of what they were doing. But you know, what everything they said can go over. Okay, so yes, a worry about that theory, not a worry about higher orderies in general, and also not a worry, and also not a thing that distinguishes my kind of literal-minded higher order interpretation of their theory from their own model theoretic interpretation of it, is that if you just do this, if you do the same thing for not, it over generates. So you can. It seems like, what the hell is going on with not, such that you can say, you can't say not Hussein is asking a question, but you can say, you know, I don't know, Eugene, but not, but not, and you also what's going on with but, such that you can say, you know, Eugene but not Hussein, but you can't say Eugene but Hussein. You know, very good and hard fiddly questions about that word not, which was not a word it didn't, in fact, not is just a very confusing word. It can go lots of places and then it just can't go other places. Why? Sorry, I'm not. I think you might think I'm about to give the answer is I don't know. It doesn't seem. I mean, that does seem like a good reason to explore alternatives to the party Ruth based orthodoxy, although you could certainly also not, you know, it's compatible with the, I mean, you can just, I mean, it's not that hard to just write in my hand all kinds of restrictions on where words can go. It's just that you'd like to, you wonder about, can you find some kind of deep explanation of why the distribution is what it is? And by the way, but not, you know, and that's a difference there between and but as well. So he, you know, Eugene and not Hussein is bad. You have to, it has to be, it can only go after but. Anyway, I don't have an answer. I don't feel like it. It is a reason to explore a whole range of alternatives to the party Ruth synthesis. I think I feel that the use I was making of that was not essential, and if someone has some alternative treatment of or in a higher order friendly way that works for the simple cases, then I should be able to generalize that one to the hard cases in the same way that I generalize the party Ruth system.
No, that's super helpful. I was just gonna simply say this, like, whatever is the right theory is, I can incorporate that into higher order system. Doesn't matter to me. Whatever is the low level explanation for this distribution. Is that the answer that you're giving?
Okay, good. So, okay, I think there's two. If you take some off the shelf thing, I bet you're thinking about Justin. Yeah, I know you're thinking about Justin Bledon's, your advisor's elaborate theory of this whole thing. If you take some off the shelf bit of semantics written in kind of the normal model theoretic framework idiom that you find in like semantics conferences. There's three things you might want to do. Thing one, redo this as some kind of higher order theory, as opposed to just a bunch of stipulative definitions of set theoretic models or something like that. But maybe a theory that's committed to a rich domain of individuals. Like that's often pretty easy. Another thing that I would want to do then is I would be sad if I was stuck then with the best theory of some phenomenon was something requiring a rich bunch of stuff in type E. So I would then typically want, but I'd be hopeful that I could take the theory that I just got and tinker with it some more to move some things up a few types into some more friendly type where I can provide that. So then that's sort of a second step. And then a third step is, can I actually make all of that consistent with the theory that I just gave of, and then there could be further problems even after that second step in harmonizing this new theory with the ideas from this paper about how we treat Mars or redness and stuff like that. So that's, I don't want to distinguish I should distinguish those different levels of kind of higher orderization.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
So I'm going to stick myself on the queue at this point.
Right.
So thanks so much. This was so interesting. I felt like I saw how all the gadgets allowed us to sort of recover these things that we say in English, but I was feeling like they allowed us to do lots of stuff that English doesn't let us do. You know, like I don't have it under my control, but I was thinking it felt like I could get something like baldness Dimitri's coming out okay, even though English doesn't allow us to do anything like that.
Right.
And so I was just wondering if you had some story about why it is that English allows certain kinds of type mismatching or co-expressing, but it doesn't allow other kinds.
Okay. There's two worries there. One worry is, will the theory in fact generate a whole bunch of bad results? And then there's another explanatory question, which is why is English set up like that rather than some other way? But let me just talk about the first question first. So I think maybe I kind of forgot to explain. So this thing I was doing, which might not be familiar to everyone, although it's very common in lots of these, in many sort of orthodox frameworks for semantic theory, where of making meaning always be relative to syntactic category. It wasn't just, I have this example about fish or something that I like, so I did, or, whatever. There's other things you could say if it was just that, but it's kind of really important to keeping once you have all these type ambiguous meanings floating around, you need to make sure that they only combine in the right ways and don't combine in the wrong ways. So one thing you need to make sure is that you're not assigning meanings to any ungrammatical strings. At least I don't want to assign meanings to ungrammatical strings, and this thing doesn't, because the only time that you ever assign a meaning to a complex thing is where, given the rules I wrote down anyway, is where that complex thing is, consists of a thing and another thing that's looking for that kind of thing on its left or right. And as it were, the fact that the second thing has that category, we're only going to give that category to things where that would be well-formed. So it'll never turn out that ill-formed things are getting meanings. And if you had an ill-formed thing, there wouldn't even be an obvious meaning for it to have. I mean, if you have something like "is interesting is red," should it be? I mean, there's various things that float around. I could take some meaning for "is red" and predicate a higher typed "is interesting" of it, or I could take some meaning of "is interesting" and predicate a higher typed "is red" of it. So it's not like there's this thing that it's crying out to mean. There isn't, because it's not even obvious which direction to go, because they don't have syntactic categories that match. So that's why there's nothing happening like so the categories are stopping ill-formed things from getting meanings, but also they're enforcing a kind of they're making sure that when say a noun phrase combines with a verb phrase, then we always have to choose the verb phrase to be the higher type thing and apply it to the noun phrase thing as opposed to the other way around. And that's actually also very, very important. If we didn't have that, then so things like something that expresses lambda x exists y xy, which is exact in any type, and that so it has exactly the same denotations as the property of being instantiated, but it's a different syntactic category, and that's why something is interesting, means something so different, has a completely different range of possible meanings from the property of being instantiated is interesting. So essentially, the answer is all of that apparatus is chugging along nicely, I believe, making sure that we're not spitting out, as it were, garbage meanings for things that result from plugging together these Lego bricks in the wrong order. Why is English like that? Well, there seems like there's just obvious communicative advantages to having that kind of discipline, rather than something more. I don't know. You could imagine a super ambiguous language where you just throw a bunch of words up and just in a bag, as it were, and people have to, and it's just up to the context for people to figure out in what order does he want to put these things together. But that just seems really hard. That's putting a lot of demands on the reader, or the hearer to figure out what might be intended. So yeah, even though there's a lot of ambiguity according to me, it's not like we're placing zero demands. Still, I think it's very helpful to have a way of signaling to the reader what's going to be an argument to what, and that kind of thing, so that they can at least kind of get in the right ballpark, rather than really having to consider a whole sort of combinatorially a whole combinatorial explosion of possible ways of assembling things. Okay, maybe that wasn't. Maybe your question was a bit more specific than that, but I hope that was kind of an answer.
Next question from Jack.
Hi, Cian. Thanks for the time.
Jack, hello.
How's it going?
Wow, Zoom is amazing. Hi, it's nice to see you.
Right. So I have a kind of flat-footed question, I guess, and I'm wondering what you would say about it. So, kind of not being deeply enmeshed in the higher orderist mindset, I'm just looking at this thing and I'm thinking, this semantic story looks really complicated. What would be wrong with just saying the truth conditions are in terms of properties and propositions and stuff of type B as abstract objects? And the reason why those inferences come so that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, like this is red, that's red, therefore there's redness in common. The reason they come so naturally to us is just that we're employing some sort of implicit theory about abstracta. We have implicit theories about all kinds of things, right? Like I infer from the fact that somebody's smiling that they're probably happy, but it's not like a semantic thing by itself.
Okay, so
or maybe a better way to put it is not.
Okay, so I guess so. Why don't I like? I mean, okay, so there's you gave a kind of an argument for that kind of theory. Okay, I don't agree with that kind of theory. You gave a kind of argument for it, and it was simpler than.
Yeah, it just seems like it would be more straightforward.
I don't think it's. I don't know. I don't know. I guess maybe I'm mine seems really simple to me now. So, or at least it's way simple. I'll tell you this, if that seemed complicated, you should have seen the stuff I was talking about, the stuff I was doing before. It really, I don't know, it seemed kind of, I mean, forget about the, okay, the treatment of disjunction. Oh, there's a little trickery there. But the basic, the treatment of Mars instantiates the property of redness is like the simplest thing in the world. Why not instead think that all English speakers just believe this anti-nominalist theory of type E things? Well, I didn't believe it. Sorry, I certainly don't believe it now. I think that everything is material. Well, whatever, something like that. I'm a and I feel like, oh, I didn't believe it in the past as well. And I just feel like I'm not some alien here. There clearly are people who have disbelieved this thing, or at least had doubts about it. And it just seems like, how could somebody not have doubts? I mean, when I think about this theory, it just feels like it's like as if we discovered some aliens, and like every single one of them believes in a certain amazing vision of like the circles of heaven and angels all doing complicated dances, and such that they can talk about, such that modulo this widely accepted theory, and some of it's drummed into them so firmly in their youth that they all just take it for granted. So much so that even when they start to have doubts about it, they somehow they can't really live by their doubts, but are kind of constantly led back to talking as if the thing's true, even though. So I don't know. It just seems really weird for a population of people it just seems like I don't given my own sense of the implausibility of the theory in question. I also feel like it's just much harder for a whole species of people of beings to have this implausible thing drummed into them so incredibly thoroughly. So the drumming the hypothesis that somehow happened just seems incredibly bad to me. So I feel like even if my theory had I don't know about the simplicity comparison, but I definitely feel like it would be worth a few I don't know what the unit of simplicity is, but a few chunks of simplicity in order to avoid having to think that this bizarre sociological phenomenon has taken place. So that's my basic standpoint. Also, when you look at the people like Cian or something who are trying to do a rigorous semantic theory, I mean, I don't know, their theory is kind of it's really complicated in a different way, because like you have to resist Russell's paradox somehow. So there's all this, but like, but you're in a specific, things get.
Well, I mean, the implicit theory could just be an inconsistent theory, right? And then people realize it's inconsistent when they reflect on it. Like, it could be that everyone's thinking in terms of just the naive theory of property. But can I ask one quick follow-up, which is like...
Sorry, we're nearing the end of time, and there's some questions left, so I think we have to limit
totally my fault for going on for so long. Sorry, the evening and the Zoom, I just like blah, blah, blah.
So I think that we have time for one more question from Karen. Sorry, I think you're muted, Karen.
Okay, sorry. So I really like the fact that you accept with Frege that quantifiers are functions from predicates from functions to truth values. But why not go the whole way with Frege? And I think it's very, very odd. Like the Fregean model is to think that syntax is a bit misleading, and what we want is a logical language in which the syntax follows the semantics. So why not go all the way with Frege and say, well, there are no abstract objects, the predicates pick out functions, and functions are not objects. And then you can say, look, redness is a physical property. Surely redness is a physical property. The thing about abstract objects is not that they're not physical. I mean, the properties aren't physical. The properties are physical things, aren't they? What if you go along with Frege and you say, okay, what people were thinking of mistakenly, we nominalize functional expressions, and we make this mistake of talking about redness, where, you know, as you want to say, okay, let's say it's a functional, its semantics is a function from objects to truth values. I mean, you've got this, you're doing it syntactically, but really you're E to T. I mean, what's a sentence if it's not something that can be true or false? Okay, that's the way Frege's thinking. And I don't think there is a non-semantic notion of the sentence. Like, the sentence is a thing that can take a truth value. A predicate is a syntactic object that indicates a function from objects to truth values. A singular term is a syntactic element that indicates an object. So the big mistake that philosophers have made is that when they want to talk about these functional things, you're forced by the syntax, by natural language syntax, to use a singular term, and then you think they're objects, but they're not. And there's nothing wrong with functions. They're definitely not objects. I mean, do you think that the plus function is an object? It's not an object. It's a function. Anyway, so I don't know why, you know, I love the fact that you go with Frege a little way, but why don't you go all the way with Frege?
I think I do go all the way with Frege. I think I accept everything you just said. I mean, it sounds like, sorry, I don't know if you mean by, it doesn't sound like what you mean by go all the way with Frege is go with Frege's theory, something like his theory of extensions, or his theory according to which there's these individual surrogates for what he calls concepts. These object surrogates that like whatever he takes to be the thing that is denoted by the expression the concept horse. That he did have that theory. He did of course, and in fact he spelled it out as basic law 5 and it was inconsistent, but he had the strong view that things that are singular terms in German or English, like the concept horse, if meaningful at all, can only denote objects, and he wanted them to be meaningful. So he was led by that to posit this rich ontology of objects, which is kind of like a reflection or surrogate of the land of functions back down in the land of objects. I don't want to do that because I think Frege was wrong about the things he called singular terms in English. I think words like the property of being red or the concept of being a horse, I don't think there's an important difference there for present purposes, are meaningful, but don't denote objects, but rather are meaningful in the very same way that predicates are meaningful. Which to use the Fregean jargon would mean they denote functions from individuals to type T things. He calls them, he thinks of type T. He has this other view, which is that there's only two things of type T. I think that's just orthogonal to the current debate. So yeah, so I think that I don't, the only places, relevant places here that I'm disagreeing with Frege is I'm not into positing object surrogates for high type things. And the reason I'm not into it is because I don't accept his view that natural language, noun phrase type things have to denote objects. Of course, in a good formal language, namely the language of higher order logic, which is also the begriff shift, I should say, roughly. So he didn't have lambda, but it's very, very close. In a good language, syntax is a guide to semantics, and indeed, if you have, a type E thing can only denote an object, but a reflection of the messiness of English, which of course or German, which of course is a Phrygian theme, is that our language isn't good like that, and we have these things which are grammatically syntactically very like regular proper names, but are semantically totally different. In fact, semantically like predicates. So apart from that, yes, I take all this to be me expanding the bits of Frege that are left over when you subtract the things I disagree with.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I think I totally agree with you, but I think in the end, Frege analyzes.
Oh, sorry, we have to. We're already over time. I'm going to have to cut you off. I'm sorry about that, Karen.
Can I just finish a sentence just quickly? I mean, he analyzes his own mistake earlier on as having been misled by the definite description in order to think of the functions as objects. And he says, the root of the problem is to confuse functions with objects.
Yeah.
So, I think it's just
great. Okay, good. So I agree with later Frege post correspondence with Russell Frege then.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Sorry to people who didn't have time to ask a question, and just join me in thanking Cian for a fantastic lecture.
Oh, thank you so much again. Thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoyed that. So thanks for the good questions. I really, really wish that I could now meet up with some of you and go out for a drink or something. But
we'll hope to have you down here in Melbourne